Let me ask you about the situation in Israel. Why did Hamas attack Israel on October 7th, 2023? As you understand the situation, what was the reason that attack happened?
Well, I think the main reason was that you had this suffocating occupation. I think as long as the occupation persists, the Palestinians are going to resist. As you well know, this is not the first time there has been a Palestinian uprising. There was the first Intifada, there was the second Intifada, now there's October 7th, and there are uprisings besides those three. So this is not terribly surprising. A lot of people hypothesize that this attack was due to the fact that the Israelis, the Saudis, and the Americans were working together to foster another Abraham Accord, and that the Palestinians would, in effect, be sold down the river. I think, given the fact that this was in the planning stages for probably about 2 years, and the Abraham Accords with regard to Saudi Arabia are a relatively new phenomenon, I don't think that's the main driving force here. I think the main driving force is that the Palestinians feel oppressed, as they should, and that this was a resistance move. They were resisting the Israeli occupation.
So that resistance, the attack involved killing a large number of Israeli civilians. There's many questions to ask there, but one is, do you think Hamas fully understood what the retaliation will involve from Israel into Gaza?
They had to understand. I mean, you had, Operation Cast Lead in 2008, 2009. It started, I think, right after Christmas 2008, and it ended right before President Obama took office in January 2009. And the Israelis periodically do what they call mowing the lawn, where they go into Gaza and they pound the Palestinians to remind them that they're not supposed to rise up and cause any problem. So there's no question in my mind that the Hamas forces understood full well that the Israelis would retaliate, and they would retaliate in force, as they have done.
Yeah, even the metaphor of mowing the lawn is disturbing to me in many ways. I actually saw Norman Finkelstein, I think, say that, well, then if you use that metaphor, then you could say that Hamas was also mowing the lawn. And it's such a horrific image because the result on either side is just the death of civilians. I mean, let me ask you about the death of civilians. So during the attack, 1,400 Israelis were killed. Over 240 were taken hostage. And then in response, as we sit today, Israel's military response has killed over 10,000 people in Gaza. And given the nature of the demographics, it's a very heavily young population. Over 40% of them are under the age of 18 of those killed. That's, of course, according to Ministry of Health of Palestinian Authority. So what do you think is the long-term effect on the prospect of peace when so many civilians die?
I mean, I think it's disastrous. I mean, the only way you're going to get peace here is if you have a two-state solution, where the Palestinians have a sovereign state of their own and there is a sovereign Jewish state. And these two states live side by side. American presidents since Jimmy Carter have understood this full well, and this is why we have pushed very hard for two-state solution. Indeed, many American Jews and many Israelis have pushed for a two-state solution because they think that that is the only way you're going to get peace between the two sides. Uh, but what's happened here is that in recent years, the Israelis have lost all interest in a two-state solution. And it's in large part because the political center of gravity in Israel has steadily moved to the right. When I was a young boy, the political center of gravity in Israel was much further to the left than it is today. And it is in it is in a position now, the political center of gravity, where there's hardly any support for a two-state solution. And Netanyahu and the rest of the people in his government were in favor or are in favor of a greater Israel. There's just no question about that. Well, on top of that, you now have had a war where, as you described, huge numbers of civilians have been killed. And you already had bad blood between the Palestinians and the Israelis before this conflict. And you can imagine how people on each side now feel about people on the other side. So even if you didn't have this opposition inside Israel to a two-state solution, how could you possibly get the Israelis now to agree to a two-state solution? I think for the foreseeable future, the animosity inside Israel towards the Palestinians is so great that it is impossible to move the Israelis in that direction. And the Israelis here are the key players, more so than the Palestinians, because it's the Israelis who control Greater Israel. It's the Israelis who you have to convince. Now, I want to be clear here. You also ultimately have to get around the fact that Hamas, right, is not committed to a two-state solution. But I think that problem could be dealt with. It's important to understand that Arafat and the PLO was once adamantly opposed to a two-state solution, but Arafat came around to understand that that was really the only hope for settling this. And he became a proponent of a two-state solution. And that's true of Mahmoud Abbas, who runs the PA in the West Bank. It's not true of Hamas at this point in time. They want a one-state solution. They want a Palestinian state. And of course, the Israelis want a one-state solution too, which is a Jewish state that controls all of Greater Israel. So the question is, can you get some sort of agreement? And I think to get to the nub of your question, given what's just happened, it's almost impossible to imagine that happening anytime soon.
The cynical perspective here is that those in power benefit from conflict, while the people on both sides suffer. Is there a degree of truth to that? Or for the people in power to maintain power, conflict needs to continue?
No, I don't believe that. I mean, just to take the Netanyahu government or any Israeli government that maintains the occupation, what you want is you want a Palestinian population that submits to Israeli domination of Greater Israel. You don't want resistance. You don't want an intifada. You don't want what happened on October 7th. In fact, I think one of the principal reasons that the Israelis are pounding Gaza and killing huge numbers of civilians, punishing the civilian population in ways that clearly violate the laws of war, is because they want the Palestinians to understand that they are not allowed to rise up and resist the occupation. That's their goal. So I think the Israelis would prefer that the Palestinians roll over and accept submission. In terms of the people who live in Gaza, to include the elites, and the people who live in the West Bank, to include the elites, they would much prefer to move to some sort of situation where the Palestinians have a state of their own. I think in the case of the PA, under Abbas, they would accept a two-state solution. I think what at this point in time Hamas wants is a one-state solution, but they want peace. All of them want peace. The two different sets of leadership in Palestine and the Israelis.
So you think Hamas wants peace?
Sure, but on its own terms. That's the point.
What does peace look like for Hamas?
At this point in time, I think peace basically means a greater Israel controlled by Palestine or Palestinians.
Okay. So essentially, I mean, it's the whole land is called Palestine, and there's no Israel.
I think at this point in time, that's their principal goal. I do believe, and there have been hints over time, Jimmy Carter has said this, that Hamas can be convinced that a two-state solution,
Mhm.
assuming that the Palestinians get a viable state of their own, that Hamas would buy into that. Can we say that with a high degree of certainty? No, but I think the Israelis should have pursued that possibility. They should have worked with Abbas. They should have worked with Hamas to do everything they can to facilitate a two-state solution, because I think ultimately that's in Israel's interest. Now, the Israeli government and most Israelis at this point in time, I believe, don't agree with that.
What do you think of Israel starting the ground invasion of Gaza recently on October 27th?
The question is, uh, should they continue until they have finally defeated Hamas? There are all sorts of reports in the media, including in the Israeli media, that they're not going to be allowed by the United States to continue this offensive for much more than a few weeks. Um, the Israelis have been saying it's going to take, in the best of all possible worlds, a number of months, if not a year, to finish off Hamas. Well, it doesn't look like they're going to have enough time to do that. I doubt whether they can finish off Hamas even if they're given the time. I think they're going to run into fierce resistance. And when they run into fierce resistance and large numbers of Israelis going to start to die, they'll lose their appetite for this. And the Israelis, surely know at this point in time that even if they finish off Hamas, even if I'm wrong and they're able to finish off Hamas, another group is going to rise up to resist the occupation. The idea that you can use what Zeev Jabotinsky called the iron wall to beat the Palestinians into submission is delusional. It's just not going to happen. The Palestinians want a state of their own. They don't want to live under occupation. And there's no military solution for Israel here. There has to be a political solution. And the only viable political solution is a two-state solution. I mean, you can't go to democracy. You can't go to a situation where you give the Palestinians equal rights inside a greater Israel, in large part because there are now as many Palestinians as there are Israeli Jews. And over time, the demographic balance shifts against the Israeli Jews and in favor of the Palestinians, in which case you'll end up with a Palestinian state in greater Israel. So, democracy for all doesn't work. The Israelis, I believe, are quite interested in ethnic cleansing. I think they saw this this recent set of events as an opportunity to cleanse Gaza, but that's not going to happen. The Jordanians and the Egyptians have made it clear that that's not happening. The United States has now made it clear that that's not happening. And the Palestinians will not leave. They'll die in place. So ethnic cleansing doesn't work. So you're really left with two alternatives, a two-state solution or a greater Israel that is effectively an apartheid state. I mean, that's what the occupation has led to. And all sorts of people have been predicting this for a long, long time. And you've now reached the point, here in the United States, if you say that Israel is an apartheid state, that's going to get you into all sorts of trouble. But the fact is that Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and B'Tselem, which is the leading Israeli human rights group, all three of those institutions or organizations have issued detailed reports making the case that Israel is an apartheid state. Furthermore, if you read the Israeli media, right, all sorts of Israelis, including Israeli leaders, refer to Israel as an apartheid state. It's not that unusual to hear that term used in Israel. This is disastrous for Israel, in my opinion. And Steve Walt and I said this, by the way, when we wrote the Israel Lobby, that Israel is an apartheid state, which is equivalent to Israel as an occupier, is not good for Israel. And that brings us back to the two-state solution. But as you and I were talking about a few minutes ago, it's hard to see how you get a two-state solution. And the end result of this conversation is utter despair.
Because the path to a two-state solution is blocked by the amount of hate that's created by civilian deaths.
Well, that plus the fact that the Israeli government is filled with people who have no interest in a two-state solution. They're ideologically deeply committed to a greater Israel. They want all the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea to be part of a Jewish state. They're just ideologically committed to that. And of course, as we were talking about before with regard to Hamas, Hamas wants everything between the river and the sea to be a Palestinian state. And, when you have two sides with those kinds of views, right, you're in deep trouble because there's little room for compromise. So what you have to do to get this to work is you have to convince the Israelis that it's in their interest to have a two-state solution. And you've already taken care of the PA on this front, the Palestinian Authority, but you've got to convince Hamas that its maximalist goals are not going to work, and it's in its interest to follow in the footsteps of Arafat and accept a two-state solution. But even if you do that at this point, let's say that, there's a lot of willingness intellectually on both sides to do that. The problem is that the hatred that has been fueled by this recent this ongoing conflict is so great that it's just hard to imagine how you can make a two-state solution work at this juncture. That's why I've sort of taken to saying, and I hope I'm wrong here, that, on the two-state solution, that boat has sailed. It's just, it's no longer possible.
Well, again, I believe in leadership, and there's other parties at play here, other nations, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, other players in the Middle East that can help. That can help through a normalization of relationships and these kinds of things. There's always hope, like you said, slither of hope.
Slither of hope.
I think human civilization progresses forward by taking advantage of all the slithers it can get. Let me ask you about, you mentioned the Israel Lobby. You wrote a book, probably your most controversial book on the topic.
Not probably. Clearly the most controversial book I ever wrote.
So you've criticized the Israel Lobby in the United States for influencing U.S. policy in the Middle East. Can you explain what the Israel Lobby is, their influence, and your criticism over the past, let's say, a couple decades?
Well, the argument that Steve Walt and I made, actually we wrote an article first, and which appeared in the London Review of Books, and then we wrote the book itself. Our argument is that the lobby is a loose coalition of individuals and organizations that push American policy in a pro-Israel direction. Basically, the lobby is interested in getting the United States, and here we're talking mainly about the American government, to support Israel no matter what Israel does. And our argument is that if you look at the relationship between the United States and Israel, it's unprecedented in modern history. This is the closest relationship that you can find between any two countries in recorded history. It's truly amazing the extent to which Israel and the United States are joined at the hip. And we support Israel no matter what, almost all the time. Our argument is that is largely due to the influence of the lobby. The lobby is an extremely powerful interest group. Now, it's very important to understand that the American political system is set up in ways that allow interest groups of all sorts to wield great influence. So in the United States, you have an interest group or a lobby like the National Rifle Association that makes it well nigh impossible to get gun control,
Yep.
right? And so with the Israel lobby, you have this group of individuals and organizations that wield enormous influence on U.S. policy toward the Middle East. And this is not surprising given the nature of the American political system. So our argument is that the lobby is not doing anything that's illegal or illicit or immoral or unethical. It's just a good old-fashioned American interest group. And it just happens to be extremely powerful. And our argument is that this is not good for the United States because no two countries have the same interests all the time. And when our interests conflict with Israel's interests, we should be able to do what we think is in our national interest, in America's national interest. But the lobby tends to conflate America's national interests with Israel's national interests and wants the United States to support Israel no matter what. We also argue, and I cannot emphasize this enough given what's going on in the world today, that the lobby's effects, the lobby has not been pushing policies that are in Israel's interest. So our argument is that the lobby pushes policies that are not in America's interest or not in Israel's interest. Now you're saying to yourself, what exactly does he mean by that? What every president since Jimmy Carter has tried to do, as I said before, is to foster a two-state solution, to push Israel, which is the dominant player in Greater Israel, push Israel to accept the two-state solution. And we have run into huge resistance from the lobby whenever we tried to, let's be blunt about it, coerce Israel, right? In a perfect world where there was no lobby and an American president was free to put pressure on Israel, to coerce Israel, I believe we would have gone a long way towards getting two-state solution. And I believe this would have been in Israel's interest. But we couldn't get a two-state solution because it was almost impossible to put meaningful pressure on Israel because of the lobby. So this was not in Israel's interest, and it was not in America's interest. And that was the argument that we made. And we, of course, got huge pushback for making that argument.
What's the underlying motivation of the lobby? Is it religious in nature? Is it similar to the way war hawks are sort of militaristic in nature? Is it nationalistic in nature? What's if you were to describe this loose coalition of people, what would you say is their motivation?
Well, first of all, I think you have to distinguish between Jews and Christians. You want to remember that there are a huge number of Christian Zionists who are deeply committed to Israel no matter what, right? And then there are a large number of Jews. The Jews are obviously the most important of those two groups in the Israel lobby. But, one of the arguments that we made in the book is that you should not call it the Jewish lobby because it's not populated just by Jews, and Christian Zionists are an important part of that lobby. But furthermore, there are a good number of Jews who are opposed to the lobby and the policies that the lobby purveys. And there are a number of Jews who are prominent anti-Zionists, right? So, and they're obviously not in the lobby. Or if you take a group like Jewish Voice for Peace, right? Jewish Voice for Peace is not in the lobby. So it's wrong to call it a Jewish lobby. But with regard to the American Jews who are in that lobby, I think that really this is all about nationalism. It's not so much religion. Many of those Jews who are influential in the lobby are not religious in any meaningful sense of that term, but they self-identify as Jewish, in the sense that they feel they're part of a Jewish nation, and that in addition to being an American, right, they are part of this tribe, this nation called Jews, and that they have a responsibility to push the United States in ways that support the Jewish state. So I think that's what drives most, if not almost all, the Jews. This is not to say there's not a religious dimension for some of them, but I think that the main connection is much more tribal in nature.
So I had a conversation with Benjamin Netanyahu, and he said fundamentally, if you're anti-Zionist, you're anti-Semitic. So the Zionist project is tied at the hip to the Jewish project. What do you have to say to that?
Look, you can define anti-Semitism any way you want, right? And you can define anti-Semitism to incorporate anti-Zionism. And I think we have reached the point where anti-Semitism is identified today, not just with anti-Zionism, but with criticism of Israel. If you criticize Israel, some people will say, you're an anti-Semite. And if that's your definition of anti-Semitism, it's taken an important term and stretched it to the point where it's meaningless, right? So when Steve and I wrote the book, wrote the article and then wrote the book, all sorts of people said that we were anti-Semites. This is a ludicrous charge, but what they meant was you're criticizing the lobby, you're criticizing Israel, and therefore you're an anti-Semite. Okay, if that's what an anti-Semite is, somebody who criticizes Israel, probably half the Jewish community, if not more in the United States, is anti-Semitic. And of course, you get into all these crazy games where people are calling Jews self-hating Jews and anti-Semites because they're critical of Israel. But even people who are anti-Zionist, I don't think they're anti-Semitic at all. You can argue they're misguided. That's fine. But many of these people are Jewish and proud of the fact that they're Jewish. They just don't believe that nationalism and Jewish nationalism is a force that should be applauded. And you want to understand that in the American context, there is a rich tradition of anti-Zionism, right? And these were not people who were anti-Semites, if you go back to the 30s, 40s, 50s. And the same thing was even true in Europe. There were all sorts of European Jews who were opposed to Zionism. Were they anti-Semites? I don't think so. But we've gotten to the point now where people are so interested in stopping any criticism of Israel that they wield this weapon of calling people anti-Semites so loosely that the term has kind of lost meaning. So I think Netanyahu is wrong-headed to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism.
Alan Dershowitz was one of the people that called you specifically anti-Semitic. So just looking at the space of discourse, how do you... Where's the slither of hope for healthy discourse about U.S. relationships with Israel between you and Alan Dershowitz and others like him?
Well, I think until there is a settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there's no hope of putting an end to this nonsense, right?
So these are just uses of terms to kind of cheat your way through the discourse.
It's
shortcut.
No, it's to silence people. Right. It's very, very important to understand that one of the lobby's principal goals is to make sure we don't have an open discourse, a freewheeling discourse about Israel, because they understand, people in the lobby understand that if you have an open discourse, Israel will end up looking very bad. Right. You don't want to talk about the occupation. You don't want to talk about how Israel was created. Right. All these subjects are ones that will cause problems for Israel. See, just to go to the present crisis, okay, when you have a disaster, and what happened on October 7th is a disaster, one of the first things that happens is that people begin to ask the question, how did this happen? Right? What's the root cause of this problem? This is a disaster. We have to understand what caused it so that we can work to make sure it doesn't happen again. So we can work to shut it down and then make sure it doesn't happen again.
Mm-hmm.
But once you start talking about the root causes, right, you end up talking about how Israel was created, right? And that means telling a story that is not pretty about how the Zionists conquered Palestine. And number two, it means talking about the occupation, right? It's not like Hamas attacked on October 7th because there were just a bunch of anti-Semites who hated Jews and wanted to kill Jews. This is not, Nazi Germany, right? This is directly related to the occupation and to what was going on inside of Gaza. And it's not in Israel's interest or the lobby's interest to have an open discourse about what the Israelis have been doing to the Palestinians since, I would say, roughly 1903, when the second Aliyah came to Israel or came to what was then Palestine, right? We want to talk about that. And we don't want to talk about, from the lobby's point of view, the influence that the lobby has, right? It's better from the lobby's point of view if most Americans think that American support of Israel is just done for all the right moral and strategic reasons, not because of the lobby. And when John Mearsheimer and Steve Walt come along and say, you have to understand that this special relationship is due in large part to the lobby's influence, that is not an argument that people in the lobby want to hear. So the point is, you have to go to great lengths for all these reasons. You have to go to great lengths to silence people like me and Steve Walt. And one of the ways to do that is to call us anti-Semites. I think the chapter or the section of the book where we talk about this charge of anti-Semitism is called The Great Silencer. That's what we call the charge of anti-Semitism, the Great Silencer. Who wants to be called an anti-Semite, especially in the wake of the Holocaust? Do I want to be called an anti-Semite? Oh, my God, no. So it's very effective. But, it is important to talk about these issues, in my humble opinion. And I think if we had talked about these issues way back when, it would have gone a long way towards, maybe getting a two-state solution, which I think was the best alternative here.
It's complicated, and I wonder if you can comment on the complexity of this, because criticizing Israel and, criticizing the lobby can, for a lot of people, be a dog whistle for sort of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that, this idea that Jews run everything, run the world, or this kind of cabal. And, it's also very true that people who are legitimately anti-Semitic are also critics of Israel in the same kind of way. And so it's such a complicated landscape in which to have discussions because, even people like David Duke, who are, racist, don't sound racist on the surface. Well, I haven't listened to him enough, but there's dog whistles. It's a complicated space in which to have discussions because I wonder if you can sort of speak to that. Because there's this silencing effect of calling everybody anti-Semitic, but it's also true that there is anti-Semitism in the world. Like, there is a sizable population of people that hate Jews. There's probably a sizable population of people who hate Muslims too. But,
a lot of hate out there.
A lot of hate out there. But the hatred of Jews has like a long history. And so you have Rolling Stones have a set of great hits. And there's just a set of great hits of the ways conspiracy theories that you can make up about the Jews that are used as part of the hatred. So there's nice templates for that. And I just wonder if you can comment on operating as a historian, as an analyst, as a strategic thinker in this kind of space.
Yeah, we obviously, when we wrote the article, which we did before the book, gave this subject a great deal of thought. I mean, what you say just now is music to our ears. I'm talking for about me and Steve. I mean, I think that, your point about dog whistles is correct. Look, we went to great lengths to make it clear that this is not a cabal. It's not a conspiracy. And in fact, in a very important way, the lobby operates out in the open, right? Uh, they brag about their power, right? And this was true before we wrote the article, right? And we said in the article and the book, and you heard me say it here. First of all, it's not a Jewish lobby, right? Um, Secondly, it's not a cabal, right? It's an American interest group. And
And the American system is designed such that interest groups are perfectly legal and some of them are super effective.
exactly, I mean, you hit the nail right on the head. That's exactly right. And, and there was nothing that we said that was anti-Semitic by any reasonable definition of that term. And, huge numbers of Jews have known me and Steve over the years, and nobody ever said that we were anti-Semitic before March 2006 when the article appeared, because we're not anti-Semitic. But look, you've got this interest group, right, that has a significant influence on American policy and on Israeli policy. And you want to talk about it. It's just important to talk about it. It's important for Jews, right, in the United States, for Jews in Israel, to talk about this. The idea that you want to silence critics is not a smart way to go about doing business, in my opinion. If we were wrong, if Steve and I were so wrong and our arguments were so foul, they could have easily exposed those arguments. They could have gone into combat with us in terms of the marketplace of ideas and easily knocked us down. The problem was that our arguments were quite powerful. And instead of engaging us and defeating our arguments, they wanted to silence us. And this is not good, right? It's not good for Israel. It's not good for the United States. And I would argue in the end, if anything, it's going to foster anti-Semitism. I think you don't want to run around telling people that they can't talk about Israel without being called an anti-Semite. It's just it's not healthy in terms of the issue that you're raising, right? But I still agree with you that it is a tricky issue. I don't want to make light of that. I know that there's this piece of literature out there called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And I fully understand that if you're not careful, you can come close to writing volume 2 of the protocol. But I don't believe that we wrote anything that was even close to that. And again, I think that a healthy debate on the issues that we were raising would have been not only in America's interest, but it would have been in Israel's interest.
Yeah, I mean, underneath it all is just, I wonder why there's so much hate against groups, why it's such a sticky way of thinking. Not just tribalism, like proud of your country and kind of hating another country, but really deeply hating, like hating in a way where it's part of your identity kind of hate.
Well, just to make a general point on this issue, in our conversation here today, you often talk about individual leaders, and the word individual often pops up in your vocabulary.
Yes.
I believe that we are ultimately social animals before we are individuals. I believe we're born into tribes, we're heavily socialized, and that we carve out space for our individualism. But we are part of tribes, and or social groups or nations, call them what you want, ethnic groups, religious groups. But the fact is that these tribes often crash into each other. And when they crash into each other, they end up hating each other. If you go to a place like Bosnia, right, the Croats and the Serbs, oh my God, and then throw in the Bosniaks, which is the term for Bosnian Muslims, and, Muslims, Croats, Serbs, and the tribes, hate each other. And in a funny way, that hatred almost never goes away. And I guess there are some exceptions to that. If you look at the Germans after World War II, they've gone a long way towards reducing, I wouldn't want to say completely eliminating, but reducing a lot of the hatred that existed between Germans and their neighbors. But that's really kind of an anomalous case. You go around East Asia today and the hatred of Japan in a place like China, the hatred of Japan in a place like Korea, just not to be underestimated. And but I think a lot of it just has to do with the fact that you're dealing with social groups that have crashed into each other at one point or another. And there are those lingering effects. And by the way, this gets back to our discussion a few minutes ago about trying to get a two-state solution between the Palestinians and the Israeli Jews now that you have had this horrible war, which is ongoing.
It's interesting to go back to World War II. Now, you said you studied Nazi Germany in the 30s from a perspective of maybe offensive realism. But just to look at the Holocaust, it's sometimes popular in public discourse today to compare certain things to the Holocaust. People have compared the Hamas attack on Israel to the Holocaust, saying things like it's the biggest attack on Jews since the Holocaust, which kind of implies that there's a comparison. People have made that same comparison in the other direction. What do you make of this comparison? Is it comparable? Is the use of the Holocaust have any accuracy in comparisons of modern day international politics?
Is it possible that you could have another genocide? Yes. And I would argue that what you had in Rwanda was a genocide, right? The Holocaust is not the only genocide. I believe the word genocide is used too loosely today. And as you know, lots of people, and I mean lots of people who are pro-Palestinian, accuse the Israelis of engaging in genocide in Gaza. I think what the Israelis are doing in Gaza represents a massacre. I would use that term, given the number of civilians that they've killed and the fact that they've been indiscriminate in terms of how they've been bombing Gaza. But I would not use the word genocide. For me, a genocide is where one side attempts to eliminate another group from the planet. I think that what happened with the Holocaust was clearly a genocide, and that the Germans were bent on destroying all of European Jewry. And if they could have gotten their hands on Jews outside of Europe, they would have murdered them as well. That's a genocide. And I think with the Hutus and the Tutsis, you had a similar situation. I think with the Turks and the Armenians during World War I, that was a genocide. But I have a rather narrow definition of what a genocide is, and I don't think there are many cases that qualify as a genocide. The Holocaust certainly does, okay? Now, what Hamas did doesn't even come close to what happened to European Jewry between, let's say, 1939 and 1945, although I date the start of the Holocaust to 1941, if we were, looking at it closely. But let's just say 1939 when they invade Poland. From 1939 to 1945, what Hamas did pales in comparison. It's hard to believe anybody would make that argument, right? Yes, a lot of Jews died, but hardly uh, hardly any compared to the number that died, at the hands of the Germans. I mean, it just no parallel at all. And furthermore, Hamas was in no position to kill all of the Jews in the Middle East. Just not going to happen.
Yeah, but there's also levels of things, using Germans using human skin for lamps. There's just levels of evil in this world.
Yes, but you don't see that that's not what Hamas is doing.
No.
I mean, I want to be very clear here. I am not justifying Hamas's killing of civilians, okay? Not for 1 second. But I'm just saying, and by the way, just to go to the Israelis and what they're doing in Gaza, right? As I said to you before, I do believe that is a massacre, and I believe that's to be condemned, the killing of civilians. This is not legitimate collateral damage. They're directly punishing the population. But I would not call that a genocide, right? And I would not compare that to the Holocaust for 1 second. I just want to be very clear on that.
Do you think if Israel could, they would avoid the death of any civilians? So you're saying there's some degree of punishment, of collective
No, they're
anger.
purposely killing civilians. This is the iron wall. They're trying to beat the Palestinians into submission, right? There's no way you kill this many civilians if you're trying to precisely take out Hamas fighters. And by the way, the Israeli spokesman, the IDF spokesman, has explicitly said that we are not pursuing precision bombing and that what we are doing is trying to, maximize the amount of destruction and damage that we can inflict on the Palestinians. And I think this is a major mistake on the part of Israel. First of all, it ends up being a moral stain on your reputation, number one. And number two, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. The Palestinians are not going to roll over and submit to Israeli domination of their life. So, the whole concept of the Iron Wall, Jabotinsky's term, was misguided. And by the way, if you look at what the Israelis are doing, they're trying to do two things. One is the Iron Wall, and that's where you punish the civilian population in Gaza and get them to submit. The other thing that they're trying to do is get Hamas. They want to destroy Hamas. And the belief there is that if they destroy Hamas, they've solved the problem. But as many Israelis know, including people on the hard right, even if you destroy Hamas, they are going to be replaced by another group, another resistance group, and that resistance group will employ terror.
Yeah, I think you've said that other terrorist organizations have used the situation in Palestine as a kind of a recruitment mechanism for a long time.
Osama bin Laden made it clear that this was one of his principal reasons for attacking the United States, right?
And the United States attacked back and got us into a 20-year war that cost the lives of millions of people, not American, but human beings.
Yeah.
And
engaged in torture.
Yeah.
No, I think if you look at how we reacted to 9/11 and how the Israelis are reacting to what happened on October 7th, there's quite a bit of similarity in that both sides, the Israeli side and the American side, are enraged, right? And they lash out and they go on a rampage. And the end result is not good.
Is there capacity within Israel or within the United States after 9/11 to do something approximating turn the other cheek, of understanding the root of terror is hate and fighting that hate with, not to sound naive, but compassion?
Well, I don't think in either case you're going to turn the other cheek. I think
Well, what I mean by that is some limited, powerful military response, but very limited
coupled with a smart political strategy.
political strategy, diplomacy.
Yeah, that's what they should have done.
Yeah.
Right.
But is there capacity for that? Or from your offensive realism perspective, it's just the odds are really low?
No, from my offensive realist perspective or my realist perspective, that's what you should do, right?
Okay.
My view is states are rational actors. They should be cunning, right? They should think about the strategic situation they're in and choose the appropriate response. And what happens, and this is why my theory is not always correct, is that sometimes states are not rational and they misbehave. I would argue in the Israeli case that it would have been good after October 7th or starting on October 7th if the United States had tried to hold the Israelis back and countenanced a more moderate response, a more take some time just to think about how to deal with this problem instead of lashing out. I think given what happened to the Israelis, given how shocked they were, given the level of fear, given the level of rage, they were going to lash out. And I don't believe that was in their interest. I think it would have made sense to think about it and to think about a smarter strategy than they're now employing. And I think, the Americans blew it. The Americans gave them a bear hug and a green light and said, we'll give you all the weaponry you need and go out and do it. And I don't think that was the smart thing to do. Look, in the wake of October 7th, the Israelis had no good strategy. Right. It's not like there's a magic formula that they just didn't see. And we should have told them what the magic formula was. Right. That's not true. They were, in a sense, caught between a rock and a hard place in terms of what to do. But there's smarter things and dumber things. And I think the Israelis lashed out in ways that are counterproductive. I think, going on a rampage and, killing huge numbers of civilians it's obviously morally wrong, but it's also just not in their strategic interest, right? I mean, because it's not going to buy them anything, right? And in fact, it's going to cost them, right? Because people all over the planet are turning against Israel. I saw, an Israeli think tank today that has been tracking protests around the world, gave some figures for what it looked like between October 7th and October 13th in terms of the number of protests around the world that were pro-Israel versus pro-Palestine. And then it looked at the numbers from October 13th up to the present. And I think the numbers were 69% were pro-Palestinian in the first 6 days after October 7th, 69%. And I think 31%, take these numbers with a grain of salt, 31% were pro-Israel. So I think it was 69 and 31. Since then, since October 13th, if you look at the number of protests around the world, 95% have been pro-Palestinian and 5% have been pro-Israel. And what this tells you is that public opinion around the world has shifted against Israel. And if you look at some of the demonstrations in places like London and Washington, D.C., it's truly amazing the number of people who are coming out in support of the Palestinians. And all of this, again, is just to support my point that it was just not smart for Israel to launch this bombing campaign. Right. You can make an argument for going after Hamas and doing it in a surgical way or as surgical a way as possible. But that's not what they did. And again, my point to you is I think that this punishment campaign is not going to work strategically. In other words, they're not going to beat the Palestinians into submission. They're not going to finish off Hamas. And at the same time, by pursuing this strategy, they're doing huge damage to their reputation around the world.
Well, I just, in the wake of October 7th, given the geopolitical context, I think there's a lot of leverage to be the great ethical superpower that demonstrate power without killing any civilians and use that leverage, diplomatic leverage, to push forward something like Abrahamic Accords with more nations, with Saudi Arabia, push for peace aggressively, peace agreements, this kind of stuff, economic relationships, all of this kind of stuff, and thereby pressure the Palestinian Authority, towards perhaps a two-state solution.
No, but I think what you're missing here, just in the Israeli case, is that the Israeli government is not interested in a two-state solution. And you want to remember that Benjamin Netanyahu, who looks very hawkish when you look at him in isolation, doesn't look so hawkish when you look at him compared to the rest of the people in his cabinet, right? He almost looks like a moderate. He's got a lot of people who are way out to the right of him. And these people, and this, of course, includes Netanyahu, are not interested in a two-state solution. So the question you have to ask yourself is, if you're Benjamin Netanyahu and it's October 7th, late in the day, what do? You're not thinking about a two-state solution. You're thinking about an occupation that's not going to end. And the question is, how do you deal with the Palestinians, given what's just happened?
Well, there's people in the cabinet, and then there's history. And history remembers great leaders. And so Benjamin Netanyahu can look in the streets of Israel and see the protests and think of how history will remember him. And I think a two-state solution is on the table for a great leader.
Well, it was there. Was he the person who was going to take advantage of it? I don't think so, but
he's a student of history. See. Well, at this point, what the we'll see it's very difficult. Like you said, 95% now, or whatever the number is, of protests. I think the window in which Israel has the ears of the world, it can do the big ethical peace action towards peace is, I think, has closed. Or maybe there's still a slither, but it's just the slippery slope of hate has taken off. It's quite depressing to watch what's going on.
I agree 100%. Unequivocally depressing.